June 1940. Franz Weber stood at the edge of the Canadian prisoner camp and stared at nothing. There was no barbed wire. There were no tall guard towers with machine guns pointing down at him. There were just open fields that stretched out to the horizon. Green grass moved in the wind. Trees lined a road in the distance. A few wooden buildings sat behind him, and that was it. He turned to the Canadian guard standing nearby. The guard wore a clean uniform. He looked relaxed, almost bored. Franz asked in broken English where the fence was. Where were the walls? The guard looked at Franz like he had asked a strange question. Then the guard shrugged and said something that made Franz's blood run cold. "You can go for a walk if you want," the guard said. "Just be back by dinner." Franz thought it was a trap. It had to be a trap. They wanted him to run so they could shoot him in the back. That's what guards did. That's what he had been told they would do. This was June of 1940, and everything Franz knew about the world was about to fall apart. Just weeks before, Franz had been a soldier in the German army. He had worn his uniform with pride. He believed in the cause. He believed what his leaders told him. Germany was strong. Germany was superior. The enemies were weak and cruel. If you got captured, they said, you would suffer. You would starve. You would be beaten. They told stories from the Great War, from 1914 to 1918, about prisoners who died in mud and cold, about camps where men ate rats to survive, about guards who treated German soldiers like animals. Franz had believed all of it. Why wouldn't he? Everyone in Germany heard the same stories. The radio told them. The newspapers printed it. His officers repeated it during training. Germany was building a new world. They had conquered Poland in 1939. They had rolled through France just weeks ago. The German war machine was unstoppable. How could the enemy possibly be better than them? But then Franz's unit got captured. It happened fast during a battle near the French coast. One moment he was firing his rifle. The next moment British soldiers surrounded him. They took his weapon. They tied his hands. They put him on a truck with other prisoners. Nobody beat him. Nobody shot anyone who surrendered. They just took them away. The journey that followed felt like a dream. They loaded Franz and hundreds of other German prisoners onto a ship. The ship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Franz had never seen so much water. For days and days there was nothing but gray waves and gray sky. Some men got sick from the rocking. Others just stared. They were going to Canada, the guard said. Franz barely knew where that was. Somewhere far away. Somewhere cold. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere. When the ship finally docked, they put the prisoners on trains. These weren't cattle cars. They were real passenger trains with seats and windows. Franz pressed his face against the glass and watched Canada roll by. He saw forests that seemed to go on forever, trees taller than buildings, rivers as wide as roads, towns with clean streets and cars parked outside houses, farms with huge red barns and green fields full of crops. The train kept going, hour after hour, day after day. Franz started to understand something that frightened him. Canada was massive. It was bigger than Germany, much bigger, and it looked rich. The infrastructure was everywhere. Power lines ran next to the tracks. Roads crossed under bridges. Factories sent smoke into the sky. Everything looked organized. Everything looked like it worked. Franz had been told that Germany had the best of everything. The best roads, the best factories, the best technology. But looking out that train window, he wasn't so sure anymore. This didn't look like a weak country. This didn't look like a place that was losing. The train finally stopped at a small town in Alberta. Lethbridge, someone said. The prisoners got off and guards marched them down a dirt road. Franz expected to see walls rising up in the distance. He expected to see guard towers with searchlights. He expected to see what a real prison camp looked like. Instead, he saw wooden buildings arranged in neat rows. He saw a flagpole with a Canadian flag moving in the wind. He saw guards standing around talking to each other. And he saw that horrible, impossible thing. No fence, no wall, nothing to keep them in. Just open prairie land stretching away in every direction. The guards lined them up, and a Canadian officer spoke to them in German. The officer said they were now prisoners of war. They would follow rules. They would work if asked, but they would be treated fairly according to international law. Then the officer said something that made no sense. He said the camp had no fence because there was nowhere to run. They were 1,000 miles from Germany. If they tried to escape, they would die in the wilderness or freeze in the winter. It was safer to stay. Franz looked at the other prisoners. They all had the same confused look on their faces. Some men whispered to each other. Others just stared. One older soldier started laughing, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who realized something terrible. The guards walked them to their barracks. Franz expected a dark, cold building with straw on the floor. Instead, he found a clean wooden structure with real beds. Each bed had 2 blankets. There were windows with glass. There was a stove in the middle for heat. There were shelves for personal items. It looked better than some German army barracks he had slept in. That first night, Franz lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling. Outside, he could hear the wind across the prairie. He could hear guards talking and laughing. He could hear nothing that sounded like a prison, and that scared him more than barbed wire ever could. The next morning, a bell rang at 6 o'clock. Franz got up, expecting the worst. In the German army, mornings meant cold water and hard bread. Sometimes there was weak coffee. Usually there was shouting. He shuffled outside with the other prisoners and followed them to a large building. The smell hit him before he walked through the door. Bacon. Real bacon frying in pans. Franz stopped walking. The man behind him bumped into his back. Franz barely noticed. He just stood there breathing in that smell. When was the last time he had bacon? His mouth started watering. His stomach made a noise. Inside the dining hall, Franz couldn't believe his eyes. Long tables filled the room. Canadian cooks stood behind a counter with huge pots and pans. Steam rose from everything. A cook waved the prisoners forward and started putting food on their plates. Scrambled eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 2 pieces of toast, real butter in little squares, a cup of coffee, sugar on the table, actual white sugar. Franz sat down and stared at his plate. This was more food than German soldiers got. This was more food than he had eaten in a single meal in months, maybe years. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The eggs were hot and fresh. The bacon was crispy. The toast had real butter that melted into the bread. He ate slowly at first, then faster, then he couldn't stop. Around him, other prisoners ate the same way. Some men had tears in their eyes. Nobody spoke. They just ate. Later, Franz found out they would get 3 meals like this every day. Lunch might be soup and sandwiches with meat and cheese. Dinner could be chicken or beef with potatoes and vegetables. Sometimes there was pie. On Sundays, they got extra portions. A guard told him each prisoner received about 3,000 calories per day. Franz didn't know exactly what that meant, but he knew it was a lot. Back in Germany, his mother's letters talked about food shortages, ration cards that didn't stretch far enough, bread made with sawdust mixed in. She was probably eating half what he ate now, maybe less. The second shock came that afternoon. A guard told Franz he could walk around the camp. Franz asked how far he could go. The guard pointed to a line of white stones about 200 feet past the last building. "Don't cross that line," the guard said. "Everything on this side is fine." Then the guard walked away. He didn't watch Franz. He didn't follow him. He just left. Franz walked slowly toward the edge of camp. His heart beat fast. This had to be a test. They wanted to see if he would try to escape. But when he reached the white stones, nothing happened. No alarm went off. No guards came running. He looked out at the prairie. Miles and miles of grass and sky. He could just walk into that. He could try to run, but where would he go? The guard was right. There was nothing out there but empty land. And even if he walked for days, he would still be in Canada, still thousands of miles from home. Over the next few weeks, Franz discovered even stranger things. Some prisoners got to work on local farms. Canadian farmers came to the camp and asked for workers. Guards picked men who seemed trustworthy and drove them out to the fields. The prisoners picked potatoes or gathered hay or fixed fences. The farmers gave them water and sometimes snacks. They treated the German prisoners like regular farm hands. At the end of each day, the farmers paid them 50 cents. The money went into special accounts in Switzerland that they could access after the war. One prisoner, named Klaus, came back from a farm and told an impossible story. The farmer had handed him a shotgun, a real gun with real shells. The farmer wanted Klaus to shoot gophers that were eating the crops. Klaus held that gun in his hands and realized he could have shot the farmer. He could have run, but he didn't. Where would he go? And besides, the farmer had given him cold lemonade and a ham sandwich for lunch. The farmer's wife had waved at him. Their kids played in the yard nearby. Klaus shot the gophers and gave the gun back at the end of the day. The farmer thanked him and said he could come back next week. Inside the camp, life got even more confusing. The Canadians set up a recreation hall with books and games. Someone donated a piano. Prisoners who knew how to play gave concerts. Other men formed a theater group. They practiced German plays and put on shows. The guards came to watch. Everyone clapped at the end. Franz went to one show and sat there in the dark listening to actors speak his language and perform a comedy. He laughed. Then he felt guilty for laughing. Then he felt confused about feeling guilty. There were sports too. The prisoners organized soccer teams. Different barracks played against each other. They made a league with standings and scores. Guards helped them mark out a proper field. Someone found real soccer balls. On Saturday afternoons, prisoners played matches while other prisoners cheered. It felt like being back in school. It felt normal. And that was the problem. How could prison feel normal? The medical care shocked Franz most of all. A prisoner named Joseph got a bad toothache. The pain got so bad he couldn't eat. Guards took him to the camp hospital. A real Canadian dentist looked at the tooth. The dentist said it needed to come out. They gave Joseph medicine so it wouldn't hurt. They pulled the tooth. They gave him more medicine for after. They didn't charge him anything. Joseph came back and told everyone the dental chair was newer than anything he had seen in Berlin. The tools were clean and shiny. The dentist was kind. Another prisoner broke his arm during a soccer game. They took him to the same hospital. A Canadian doctor set the bone and put on a cast. The doctor checked on him every few days. The arm healed perfectly. The prisoner said the hospital had X-ray machines and proper operating rooms. He said it was better equipped than military hospitals he had seen in Germany. At night, Franz lay in his warm bed under his 2 blankets and tried to make sense of it all. He was a prisoner of war. He was supposed to be suffering. He was supposed to be punished. Instead, he was gaining weight. His skin looked healthier. His teeth were getting fixed. He played soccer on Saturdays. He ate 3 hot meals a day. He could walk almost wherever he wanted. He went to plays and concerts. Meanwhile, his letters from home got worse each week. His mother wrote about air raids. His brother wrote about food shortages. His sister wrote about factories being bombed. Germany was supposed to be winning. Germany was supposed to be strong. So why did the losers have so much? Why did the enemy treat him better than his own country treated its people? Franz stared at the dark ceiling and felt something crack inside his mind. A small crack, just the beginning, but it was there. Snow came to the camp in December 1943. Franz had been a prisoner for 3.5 years now. The war still raged across Europe. Franz heard about it in letters and sometimes from guards who talked about the news. Germany was not winning anymore. The Russians were pushing back. American bombers filled the skies over German cities. But inside this camp in Lethbridge, Alberta, Franz lived in a different world. The cold bit hard that winter. Temperatures dropped below zero. Snow covered everything in white. But inside the barracks, stoves kept the rooms warm. Franz had 3 blankets now. He had a coat the Canadians gave him. He had wool socks. He was warmer than he had ever been during winter in the German army. He was definitely warmer than people back home. His mother's last letter mentioned heating coal being rationed. She wrote about wearing her coat inside the house. She wrote about going to bed early because it was too cold to stay up. Franz read that letter in his warm room and felt something heavy in his chest. Christmas Eve arrived on a Friday. Franz woke up that morning not thinking much about it. Christmas didn't mean much during war, but when he got to breakfast, he noticed the Canadian guards seemed excited. They smiled more than usual. Some of them were decorating the dining hall. They hung paper chains in red and green. They put up a small tree in the corner. One guard hummed a Christmas song while he worked. The camp commander made an announcement at lunch. Tonight there would be a special Christmas dinner. Everyone would attend. There would be guests from town. Franz didn't know what that meant. He went back to his barracks and tried not to think about home. Tried not to think about Christmas 3 years ago when he was still in Germany, when his family was together, when the world made sense. That evening, guards came and told everyone to go to the dining hall. Franz walked through the snow with the other prisoners. The sun was setting. The sky turned orange and pink. His breath made clouds in the air. When he opened the door to the dining hall, warm air rushed over him, and the smell, oh, the smell, roasted meat, baked bread, something sweet, pine from the Christmas tree, candles burning. The tables were different tonight. Someone had put white cloths over them. Real plates sat at each spot instead of the metal trays. There were glasses for drinks, folded napkins. In the corner, the little Christmas tree had candles on it. Their light danced and flickered. Franz stood there, taking it all in. Other prisoners filed in around him. Everyone got quiet. Nobody knew what to think. Then the food came out. Canadian cooks brought huge platters to the tables. Roasted turkey, baked ham, mashed potatoes with butter melting on top, carrots and green beans, fresh bread rolls still hot from the oven, gravy in bowls, cranberry sauce dark and red. Franz sat down and stared. This was more food than he had seen on one table in years. This was a feast. This was the kind of meal rich people ate before the war, and they were giving it to prisoners. A guard poured something into Franz's glass. Beer. Real beer. Not much, but real. Franz picked up his fork and knife. Around him, 300 German prisoners did the same. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone started eating. Then everyone did. The room filled with the sounds of forks and knives on plates, of chewing, of glasses being set down, of men who had forgotten what a real meal tasted like. The turkey was perfect, juicy and tender. The ham had a sweet glaze on it. The potatoes were smooth and creamy. The vegetables were fresh, not from cans. The bread was soft inside with a crispy crust. Franz ate until his stomach hurt. Then he ate more. He couldn't stop. It felt wrong to stop. This might never happen again. After dinner, the door opened and cold air blew in. A group of people walked inside, Canadian people from the town, men and women and even some children. They carried boxes and bags. Franz tensed up. What was happening now? But the Canadians just smiled. They walked around the tables and handed out gifts. Small things. A bar of chocolate, a pack of cigarettes, a pair of warm socks, a book. One woman with gray hair stopped at Franz's place. She handed him a package wrapped in brown paper. "Merry Christmas," she said in English. Franz took it with shaking hands. He opened it slowly. Inside was a wool scarf, dark blue, handmade. Franz looked up at the woman. She smiled at him. Her eyes were kind. She patted his shoulder and moved on to the next prisoner. Franz held that scarf and felt something break inside him. This woman had spent time making this. She had knitted it with her own hands. For him, for a German soldier, for someone whose country was trying to kill her country's men, for the enemy, and she had made it with care. The stitches were even and tight. The wool was soft. It was a good scarf, a real gift. Someone started singing. A German prisoner with a strong voice, the words to Silent Night in German. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Other voices joined in, more and more until the whole room sang. Franz sang too. He hadn't sung in years. His voice cracked. Then something amazing happened. The Canadian Guard started singing. The same song, but in English. Silent Night, Holy Night. The townspeople sang too. Two languages mixing together. Two groups of people who were supposed to be enemies, singing the same song about the same night, about the same hope for peace. Franz looked around the room through wet eyes, at the German prisoners with full stomachs, at the Canadian guards with gentle faces, at the townspeople who brought gifts, at the Christmas tree with its candles, at the empty plates that had held more food than anyone back in Germany would see this year. And he understood something that made his whole world flip upside down. These people didn't hate him. They didn't want revenge. They pitied him. They felt sorry for him. They knew he had been lied to. They knew he came from a place that was falling apart. And instead of being cruel, they showed him what a real country looked like. A country that had so much it could give feasts to its enemies. A country that was so confident it didn't need fences. A country so strong it could be kind. Franz thought about the propaganda posters back home, about the speeches that said Germans were the master race, about the promises of German superiority, about the new world order they were building. And then he thought about his mother eating bread with sawdust in it, his brother in a factory that got bombed every week, his sister hiding in basements during air raids. He thought about German cities being destroyed, German soldiers freezing to death in Russia, German children going hungry. And here he sat, the enemy prisoner, full of turkey and ham, warm, safe, with a handmade scarf from a woman who had no reason to be kind to him. The lie became clear. How could Germany be superior when it couldn't feed its own people? How could Germany be the master race when it lost to countries that could throw Christmas feasts for prisoners? How could any of it be true when the evidence was right in front of him every single day? Franz went back to his warm barracks that night. He lay in bed holding his new scarf. Outside, snow fell quietly. The stove glowed with heat. His stomach was full. His body was healthy. He had gained 30 pounds since arriving in Canada. 30 pounds while his country starved. And in that moment, Franz stopped being a German soldier who believed in the cause. He became just a man who saw the truth. The propaganda had been a lie, all of it, and he couldn't unsee that now. The crack in his mind had split wide open. There was no going back. May 1946. The war was over. Germany had surrendered exactly 1 year ago. Franz stood on the dock in Halifax waiting to board a ship that would take him home. Home. The word felt strange in his mind. He had been gone for 6 years. 6 years since that day he got captured in France. 6 years since he thought his life was over. Instead, those 6 years in Canada had been the best years he could remember. That thought made him feel guilty and confused and sad all at once. Franz carried a small bag with his things. Inside were English textbooks he had studied, a manual about Canadian farming methods, photographs of the camp, pictures of prisoners playing soccer, a photo of the Christmas dinner from 1943, the blue scarf that woman had given him, now worn soft from use. These were his treasures. These were proof that what happened was real. The ship pulled away from Canada, and Franz watched the land get smaller. Other prisoners stood on the deck with him. Nobody talked much. They all knew what they were going back to. The letters had prepared them. Germany was destroyed. Cities were rubble. Millions of people were dead. The country was divided up between the winning countries. There was no food, no jobs, no future that anyone could see clearly. Franz pulled his Canadian coat tighter around him and wondered what he would find. The ship crossed the Atlantic, the same ocean he had crossed 6 years ago, going the other way. But Franz was a different person now. He spoke English. He knew how to fix tractors. He understood how democracies worked. He had seen what a country looked like when it treated people with dignity. He had learned that propaganda was just lies wrapped in a flag. The old Franz who believed in the cause was dead. This new Franz didn't know what he believed in anymore, except maybe kindness and truth and the importance of a good meal. The ship docked in Hamburg in early June. Franz walked down the ramp and stepped onto German soil for the first time in 6 years. The smell hit him first, smoke and dust and something rotten. Then he looked around and his heart sank. Hamburg wasn't a city anymore. It was a graveyard. Buildings stood like broken teeth. Whole blocks were just piles of bricks. People walked through the streets like ghosts. Thin people, dirty people, people with empty eyes. Franz made his way through the ruined streets. Every corner brought new horror. A church with no roof. A school that was just one wall. A park that was now a crater. He passed people digging through rubble looking for anything useful. Children with hollow cheeks begged for food. Old women pushed carts full of broken things they hoped to trade. This was Germany. This was the master race. This was what superiority looked like. It took Franz 3 days to reach his hometown. 3 days of walking and hitching roids on army trucks. 3 days of seeing nothing but destruction. When he finally knocked on his mother's door, he barely recognized her. She had aged 20 years. Her hair was white. Her face was lined and thin. Her hands shook. When she opened the door and saw him, she screamed. Then she cried. Then she touched his face like she couldn't believe he was real. His mother pulled him inside. The house was cold even though it was summer. Half the windows were boarded up. The furniture was mostly gone, probably burned for heat during the winter. His mother made him sit down. She stared at him. "You're so healthy," she kept saying. "Look at you. You're so healthy." Franz realized he probably weighed 40 pounds more than her. He had color in his face. She looked gray. His mother made tea. Real tea was gone, so it was made from dried leaves and roots. She put a small piece of bread on a plate. "This is half my ration for today," she said. "But you need to eat." Franz looked at that piece of bread. It was dark and hard, maybe 2 inches across. This was half a day's food. He thought about the breakfasts in Canada, the eggs and bacon and toast with butter. He thought about eating until he was full, until he couldn't eat anymore. And here was his mother giving him half her bread. He couldn't eat it. He pushed it back to her. They argued. Finally, they split it. Neither piece was enough to stop the hunger. Over the next few days, Franz learned what life was like now. Food rations were 1,200 calories per day, less than half what he got as a prisoner. People stood in line for hours to get their bread and potatoes. The black market was the only place to get real food, but it cost more than anyone had. Franz's brother was dead, killed in Russia in 1944. His sister had survived, but her husband was gone. Nobody knew where. Probably dead in a camp somewhere. People asked Franz about the prison camp. He tried to explain. He told them about the food, the warm barracks, the lack of fences, the Christmas dinner, the Canadian families who brought gifts. They looked at him like he was crazy. Some people got angry. "You got fat while we starved," one neighbor said. "You were safe while we got bombed." Franz understood their anger. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. He had been the enemy and got treated better than the citizens of his own country. At night, Franz lay on a thin mattress in his childhood room, the same room he had slept in before the war. But everything was different now. The window was cracked. The walls had water damage. It was cold and damp and dark. He thought about his bed in Canada, the 2 blankets, the warm stove, the full stomach. In Canada, he had been a prisoner, but he could walk freely. Here he was free, but felt trapped by hunger and cold and despair. Franz started having a terrible thought, a thought that made him feel like a traitor. He missed Canada. He actually missed being a prisoner of war. How could that be possible? How could captivity be better than freedom? But it was true. In Canada, he had hope. He had food. He had friends. He had purpose. Here he had nothing but ruins and rations and memories of better days that would never come back. Months passed. Franz tried to help rebuild. He used the farming skills he learned in Canada to work on a farm outside town. The farmer paid him in food, potatoes mostly, sometimes an egg. Franz gave most of it to his mother. He watched her eat and thought about that Christmas turkey, the ham, the fresh bread, the butter, all of it given to prisoners while German civilians starved. The cruelty of it made him angry. But who should he be angry at? Canada for being kind to him? Or Germany for lying to its people and leading them into destruction? In 1948, Franz heard that some former prisoners were going back to Canada. The Canadian government was letting them immigrate. There was land, jobs, a future. Franz thought about it every day. He could go back. He could have a real life. But what about his mother? His sister? Could he abandon them? In the end, over 6,000 German prisoners made that choice. They left Germany and went back to the country that had held them captive. They married Canadian women. They became farmers and businessmen. They built new lives in a land that had shown them mercy. Franz stayed. He stayed because of family, because of duty, because someone had to help rebuild. But he kept his English books. He kept his photographs. He kept that blue scarf. And on hard days, when the hunger was bad and the cold was worse, he would take out those photos and remember. Remember that there was a place in the world where enemies could become friends, where abundance was real, where kindness wasn't weakness. Years later, Franz told his grandchildren about the camp with no fences, about the guard who said you can go for a walk if you want, about the Christmas dinner that changed everything, and he told them the truth he learned, the truth that haunted him and freed him at the same time. Canada won the war before they ever fought us, he said. They won by showing us what we could have been. They defeated us, not by breaking our bodies, but by proving we had been lied to all along. The strongest prison isn't made of wire and walls. It's made of lies you believe about yourself and others. and the only way to escape is for someone to be kind enough to show you the truth. Franz lived until 1984. He never went back to Canada, but he never forgot it either. In his mind, he could still taste that Christmas turkey, still feel the warmth of that stove, still hear Silent Night sung in 2 languages, still see the face of that woman who gave him a scarf for no reason, except that it was Christmas and he was human, and that was enough. Sometimes the greatest weapon isn't violence, it's showing your enemy that they were wrong about you, and maybe, just maybe, wrong about everything.
March 1978, the North Atlantic. The ocean is not silent. To the untrained ear, it is a tomb, a vast crushing abyss of black water and freezing temperatures. But to Captain First Rank Valery Kulikov, standing in the cramped, humid control center of a Soviet Project 671 submarine, known to the West as the Victor class, the ocean is a cacophony. It is a noisy, chaotic battlefield. There is the groan of tectonic plates shifting miles below, the shrill songs of whales echoing across thermal layers, and the constant rhythmic churning of the surface waves crashing far above. Kulikov is a veteran of the Northern Fleet. He knows these sounds. He knows how to hide inside them. His mission, handed down directly from the Admiralty in Severomorsk, is simple on paper but terrifying in practice. Breach the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, disappear into the open Atlantic, and simulate a missile strike vector against the American eastern seaboard. This is the holy grail of Soviet naval doctrine. If a Victor-class submarine can vanish into the Atlantic undetected, the Soviet Union holds a knife to the throat of the United States. It means the balance of power is maintained. It means the Americans cannot strike first, because they do not know where the retaliation will come from. Kulikov checks the depth gauge, 200 meters. Speed, 5 knots. At this speed, the Victor is a ghost. The screw is barely turning, generating 0 cavitation. The machinery inside the hull is mounted on rubber rafts to dampen vibration. They are running ultra-quiet. In the mind of Captain Kulikov and his political officer, they are a hole in the water. They do not exist. The navigation officer marks their position on the chart with a grease pencil. They are crossing the threshold, the invisible line between the Barents Sea and the open ocean. This is the danger zone. This is where the Americans hunt. But Kulikov is confident. His hydroacoustic operators report clear water. No propeller noises, no active sonar pings, no American hunter-killer submarines trailing their wake. They are safe. They have slipped the net. And then, the impossible happens. It does not begin with a bang, but with a sound that makes the blood freeze in the veins of every man in the command center. Splash, splash, splash. It is the distinct, terrifying sound of objects hitting the water from the air. Hydroacoustics! Kulikov snaps, his voice cutting through the humidity. Report! The sonar operator presses the headphones hard against his skull, his eyes wide with confusion. Captain, sonobuoys, active pattern. They are dropping them right on top of us. Kulikov's heart hammers against his ribs. This makes no sense. To drop sonobuoys, listening devices deployed from aircraft, the Americans must know exactly where the submarine is. But that is physically impossible. The Soviet submarine has been silent for 3 days. They have not used their radar. They have not used their radio. They have not surfaced. There is no ship above them. There is no American submarine behind them. Emergency dive! Kulikov roars. Rudder hard left. Flank speed. Get us under the thermal layer. The deck tilts violently. The calm silence of the control room shatters as the crew scrambles to their battle stations. The reactor hum rises to a whine as the turbines kick in. The stealth is gone now. Survival is the only objective. But as the Victor-class boat dives deep, twisting and turning to shake off the pursuit, the nightmare deepens. A dull, metallic thrum, thrum, thrum fills the water. It is the sound of powerful twin screws, an American destroyer. And it is not searching. It is driving fast, directly toward their intercept point. They are going active! The sonar operator screams. A split second later, The hull rings like a struck bell. Ping. The sound is so loud it feels like a physical blow. Active sonar. The Americans aren't looking for them anymore. They have found them. They have a firing solution. If this were a hot war, Kulikov and his 80 men would be dead in seconds, crushed by the pressure of the imploding hull before they even realized they had been hit. Kulikov grips the periscope railing, his knuckles white. Confusion wars with fear in his mind. This was not a chance encounter. The American aircraft did not just stumble upon them in millions of square miles of open ocean. They were waiting. They arrived at the exact coordinates, at the exact time, as if they had Kulikov's own charts in front of them. Evasive maneuvers, he orders, but his voice lacks the conviction of command. He knows deep down it is futile. For the next 4 hours, the Soviet submarine is hounded. Every time Kulikov changes course, the destroyers above adjust to match. Every time he tries to hide under a thermal layer, a temperature change in the water that usually deflects sonar, the sonobuoys are waiting for him on the other side. It is as if the ocean itself has turned transparent. It is as if the Americans are watching him through a glass floor. Finally, after an exhausting game of cat and mouse, the Americans break off. They have made their point. They have humiliated the pride of the Soviet Navy. Kulikov orders the boat to return to the Barents Sea. The mission is a failure. But the failure is not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is the mystery. As the submarine limps back toward the ice, the officers gather in the wardroom, the air thick with cigarette smoke and fear. They do not speak of incompetence. They do not speak of bad luck. They speak of the phantom. There is no way they could have heard us, the chief engineer insists, slamming his hand on the table. Our machinery noise was below background levels. We were quieter than the shrimp. Physics says they cannot detect us. Maybe a satellite, the political officer suggests, his voice trembling. Maybe they have a satellite that can see through water. Impossible, Kulikov says, staring at the steel bulkhead. Water blocks radio waves. Water blocks light. No satellite can see a submarine at 200 meters. The silence that follows is heavy. If it is not a satellite, and it is not a spy ship, and it is not a traitor on board, then what is it? This incident in 1978 is not an isolated event. Across the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet, the reports are beginning to pile up on the desks of the admirals in Moscow. A pattern is emerging. A terrifying, inexplicable pattern. Soviet submarines, the most expensive and complex machines ever built by the USSR, are being intercepted with impossible precision. They leave port in total secrecy. They follow randomized routes. They maintain strict radio silence. And yet, time and time again, they arrive at a remote patch of the Atlantic, only to find a US Navy P-3 Orion circling overhead, waiting for them like a vulture. To the Soviet High Command, this is not just a tactical problem, it is an existential crisis. The entire strategy of the Cold War relies on mutually assured destruction. The Soviet Union builds thousands of nuclear missiles placed on submarines to guarantee that if America attacks, the submarines will survive to strike back. This guarantee is what keeps the peace. It is the shield of the motherland. But if the ocean is transparent, if the Americans can see every submarine, track every movement, and wait for every captain, then the shield is made of paper. The Kremlin is in a state of quiet panic. They are spending billions of rubles to build titanium hulls, quieter reactors, and faster torpedoes. They are bankrupting their economy to achieve naval parity. But it seems that no matter how much money they spend, the Americans are always one step ahead. They are fighting a ghost. Before we unravel this investigation and dive into the paranoia that gripped the Soviet intelligence services, take a moment to subscribe to Cold War Chronicles. We explore the hidden history of the conflict that defined our world, dissecting the technology and the strategies that kept the superpowers on the brink. Click the subscribe button to join the analysis. The stakes could not be higher. By the late 1970s, the Soviet military leadership is beginning to suspect something dark and supernatural about American technology. Imagine the psychological toll on the crews. Men like Captain Kulikov are trained to believe in their equipment. They are told that their vessel is the apex predator of the sea, but they are venturing out into the dark water with the gnawing sensation that they are being watched from the moment they leave the dock. The paranoia begins to rot the discipline of the fleet. Commanders start to second-guess their orders. They start to see phantoms on their sonar screens. They begin to execute wild, dangerous maneuvers, the famous Crazy Ivan, where a submarine suddenly turns 180 degrees to check its blind spot, the area behind the submarine where its own propeller noise blocks the sonar. In the Kremlin, the KGB is tasked with finding the answer. They are told to look for spies. They are told to look for new American radar systems. They are told to look for anything that explains why the ocean has eyes. But they are looking in the wrong places. They are looking at the sky, searching for satellites. They are looking at the hulls of their ships, searching for tracking beacons. They are interrogating their own sailors, searching for leaks. They do not realize that the answer lies in the one place they believe is safe, the deep, crushing darkness of the ocean floor itself. The impossible event encountered by Captain Kulikov was not a glitch. It was a demonstration of a capability so advanced, so secret, and so massive that the Soviet mind could not even conceive of its existence. The Soviets believe the ocean is a place of silence. They are about to learn that to the Americans, the ocean is a wired room. And the microphone has been on for 20 years. Moscow, the Ministry of Defense, 1979. The file on the desk of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, is stamped with the highest classification level available to the Soviet Union. Special importance. It is not a file about victory. It is a file about a ghost. Gorshkov is a legend. He is the man who transformed the Soviet Navy from a coastal defense force into a global superpower. He built the fleets that now patrol the world's oceans. But as he stares at the reports from the Northern Fleet, the legend feels powerless. The report from Captain Kulikov is not unique. It is merely the latest entry in a dossier that has been growing thicker for 5 years. The data is consistent, and it is maddening. Item 1. A Project 667. Yankee-class submarine carrying 16 ballistic missiles attempts to patrol near Bermuda. Within 6 hours of entering the sector, 2 US Navy destroyers box it in. Item 2. A Charlie-class cruise missile submarine attempts to transit the Guyuk Gap, the choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. It runs deep and slow. It is intercepted by a British frigate that seems to be waiting at the exact exit point of the channel. Item 3. A frantic transmission from a submarine commander in the Pacific, claiming that American aircraft were dropping practice depth charges on his position while he was stationary and silent, hovering over a trench. Gorshkov lights a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the high ceilings of his office. He looks at his intelligence officers, the men from the GRU, military intelligence, and the naval staff. "Explain this," Gorshkov demands, his voice low, dangerous. "How do they know?" A colonel from the Naval Intelligence Directorate clears his throat. He is sweating. "Comrade Admiral, we have analyzed the acoustic profiles. Our submarines are quieter than they were 5 years ago. The Americans should not be able to hear us at these ranges. The physics of sound transmission do not support these intercepts." "Physics?" Gorshkov spits the word out. "Do not talk to me of physics. Talk to me of results. Are you telling me the Americans have rewritten the laws of nature?" We believe there must be a leak," the colonel says. It is the safest answer in the Soviet Union. If technology fails, blame a traitor. This triggers the first phase of the investigation, the Great Witch Hunt. For the next 2 years, the KGB turns the Soviet Navy inside out. They are convinced that for the Americans to find submarines with such pinpoint accuracy, there must be a spy network of unprecedented scale operating within the Murmansk and Vladivostok naval bases. Counterintelligence officers swarm the docks. They interrogate the families of submarine crews. They bug the apartments of captains. They analyze the trash of the maintenance workers who install the rubber sound dampening tiles on the hulls. They are looking for the golden source, the traitor who is broadcasting the fleet's movements to Langley. Men are fired. Careers are ruined. Some officers are quietly arrested and never seen again, accused of negligence or unauthorized communication. But the intercepts continue. If anything, they get worse. The Americans seem to be getting bolder. They are no longer just tracking the submarines. They are toying with them. American attack submarines, the fast, lethal Los Angeles class, begin to appear in the baffles, the blind spot behind the propeller, of Soviet boats, staying there for days, undetected, before pinging their sonar once to say, "You are dead," and then vanishing. The traitor theory begins to lose weight. No spy could possibly know the real-time position of a submarine that has been underwater for 3 weeks, running a random zigzag pattern in the middle of the Sargasso Sea. A spy on land can tell you when a ship leaves port. He cannot tell you where it is 1,000 miles later. The investigation shifts. If it is not a human, it must be a machine. The Soviet scientific community is mobilized. The Academy of Sciences sets up special committees to study non-acoustic detection. This is where the investigation takes a turn into the bizarre. The Soviets begin to believe that the Americans have developed technology that borders on magic. One prevailing theory is the satellite thermal scar. The Soviet scientists hypothesize that a nuclear submarine, even deep underwater, releases a tiny amount of heat from its reactor. This heat rises to the surface, creating a microscopic temperature difference on the waves, perhaps only a fraction of a degree. The theory goes that American spy satellites, equipped with impossible infrared sensors, can see these thermal scars from space. They believe the ocean is being scanned from orbit like an X-ray. The Soviets spend millions of rubles trying to counter this imaginary threat. They experiment with specialized paints. They try to design mixing systems to disperse the heat of the reactor water. They waste years chasing a ghost in the sky, looking up at the stars, convinced the eye of God is watching them from the vacuum of space. Another faction in the GRU becomes obsessed with wake detection. They believe the Americans can detect the microscopic changes in water density left behind by a submarine's hull, even hours after it has passed. They start designing sensors to measure radiation trails, chemical traces, even the magnetic anomaly of the steel hull moving through the Earth's magnetic field. They are overthinking it. They are looking for complex, exotic sci-fi solutions because they simply cannot accept the humiliating truth. Their quiet submarines are essentially loud tractors chugging through a library. The paranoia reaches the highest levels of the Kremlin. Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB and future leader of the Soviet Union, becomes personally involved. He is a man who sees conspiracies in the shadows. To him, this American capability is a sign of a first strike preparation. If the Americans can see the Soviet missile submarines, they can destroy them. If they can destroy them, the Soviet Union has no deterrent. They are preparing for war, Andropov tells his inner circle. They are blinding us before they strike. The atmosphere in the Soviet naval bases changes from pride to dread. Submarine crews call their vessels iron coffins. They know that the moment they slip under the waves, they are likely already targeted. The bravado of the early Cold War evaporates. To fix this, the Soviet engineers are ordered to work harder. They are told to build the Black Hole, a submarine so quiet it cannot be heard. They begin work on the improved Kilo class and the Akula class. They steal Toshiba milling machines from Japan to create quieter propellers. They are desperate to close the gap. But even with these improvements, the ghost remains. In 1981, a Soviet intelligence ship, a trawler bristling with antennas disguised as a fishing vessel, is drifting off the coast of Iceland. Its mission is to monitor NATO communications. The radio operator on the trawler intercepts a strange signal. It is not a voice. It is not a standard radar pulse. It is a burst of data, a coded transmission going from a shore station in Iceland to a relay satellite, and then down to Norfolk, Virginia, the headquarters of the US Atlantic Fleet. The Soviet analysts break down the timing. 12:05 p.m. A Soviet Victor III submarine passes a specific coordinate near the Reykjanes Ridge. 12:05 p.m. The shore station in Iceland transmits the data burst. 12:15 p.m. A US Navy P-3 Orion takes off from Keflavik Air Base. 12:45 p.m. The Orion drops a sonobuoy right on top of the Victor III. The correlation is perfect. The Americans didn't find the sub with the plane. The plane was sent to the sub. The detection happened before the aircraft even took off. The realization hits the GRU analysts like a sledgehammer. The sensor is not on the plane. The sensor is not on a ship. The sensor is not in space. The sensor is fixed. It is a stationary object, and for it to detect a submarine hundreds of miles away, it must be massive. The Soviets frantically pull out their charts of the Atlantic Ocean. They look at the bathymetry, the map of the ocean floor. They look at the choke points, the gaps between the continents. They begin to suspect the unthinkable. What if the Americans have wired the ocean? What if they have laid cables? But the admirals dismiss it. Impossible, they say. To cover the Atlantic would require thousands of kilometers of cable. It would require microphones that can withstand the crushing pressure of the deep for decades. It would require a power source we cannot imagine. And the data, the sheer amount of noise. How could they filter the sound of a submarine from the sound of the ocean itself? The Americans are good, one admiral is rumored to have said, but they are not gods. They dismiss the cable theory because it is too ambitious. It is too expensive. It is too technically difficult. They are wrong. They are judging American ambition by Soviet limitations. They do not realize that while the Soviet Union was building tanks and missiles, the United States was investing in something else entirely: information dominance. While the Soviets were looking for a weapon, the Americans had built a nervous system. And the heart of this system was not a weapon at all. It was a project born in the desperate days of 1950, a project that had been running in total silence for 30 years. The Soviets are asking, where is the enemy? The answer is, you are swimming inside him. Naval Facility, Point Sur, California, 1981. While the admirals in Moscow were chasing thermal scars and radiation ghosts, the answer to their nightmare was sitting in a windowless concrete building perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Inside, the air is cool and smells faintly of ozone and stale coffee. There are no windows. The only light comes from the fluorescent tubes overhead and the glow of banks of electronic consoles. The room is filled with the low, rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch of stylus needles dragging across moving rolls of sensitive paper. Seated in front of one of these consoles is not a spy, nor a scientist, nor a hardened commando. It is a 20-year-old sonar technician second class. He is drinking a Coke and staring at a sheet of paper that looks like a chaotic seismograph readout. To the untrained eye, the paper is a mess of static black squiggles representing the noise of the ocean. Shrimp snapping, waves crashing, the distant rumble of commercial shipping traffic. But the technician is not looking at the static. He is trained to look through it. He spots a faint vertical line emerging from the background noise. It is a discrete frequency, a constant tone. He adjusts a dial, refining the sensitivity. The line grows darker. He grabs a ruler and measures the spacing between this line and the faint harmonic lines appearing next to it. He checks a classified reference binder on his desk. The frequency matches the rotational rate of a specific type of reduction gear. The harmonic overtones match the blade rate of a specific 7-bladed propeller. He picks up a phone handset. "Watch, officer," he says calmly. "I have a contact, Sierra class signature. Sector 4, confidence high." He does not know exactly where the submarine is yet. He only knows it is out there, somewhere in the vast Pacific. But miles away, at another naval facility in Centerville Beach, another operator is seeing the same line. They triangulate. 2 lines cross on a map. The coordinates are relayed to the Fleet Ocean Surveillance Information Center. From there, orders are flashed to a patrol squadron. A P-3 Orion aircraft launches. The entire process takes less than 20 minutes. The Soviet submarine captain, thousands of miles away, cruising at a depth of 300 meters, believes he is alone in the void. In reality, his position has just been marked on a map in a room he doesn't know exists, by a system he cannot see. This is SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. It was the greatest secret of the Cold War. For decades, it was classified higher than the atomic bomb. While the public focused on the space race, rockets, moon landings, and satellites, the United States Navy was winning the ocean race with a project of equal complexity and arguably greater strategic importance. The origin of this impossible capability goes back to the early 1950s to a discovery made by American scientists Maurice Ewing and Joe Wurzel. They were studying the physics of sound in the ocean, and they discovered a phenomenon that changed warfare forever. They found the Deep Sound Channel, also known as the SOFAR, Sound Fixing and Ranging Channel. The ocean is not a uniform block of water. It is layered. Near the surface, the water is warm. Deep down, the water is freezing and under immense pressure. Sound waves travel at different speeds depending on temperature and pressure. Ewing and Wurzel discovered that at a specific depth, usually around 1,000 meters in the Atlantic, these factors cancel each other out to create a sound duct. If you make a sound within this channel, the sound waves do not disperse. They get trapped. They bounce off the upper warm layers and the lower pressure layers, focusing the energy like a fiber optic cable made of water. The result was mind-bending. A small explosion detonated in the SOFAR channel near Australia could be heard in Bermuda. Sound did not just travel for miles, it traveled for thousands of miles. The US Navy realized the implication immediately. If they could place microphones, hydrophones, directly into this axis, they wouldn't need to be near a Soviet submarine to hear it. They could hear it from the other side of the ocean. This triggered Project Caesar. It was an engineering feat that rivaled the construction of the interstate highway system. Under the guise of oceanographic research, the US Navy, working with Bell Labs and Western Electric, began to wire the ocean floor. Massive cable-laying ships, looking like innocent merchant vessels, crisscrossed the Atlantic and Pacific. They carried thousands of miles of armored coaxial cable. At specific intervals, they lowered massive hydrophone arrays, structures the size of buses, packed with sensitive listening equipment, onto the seabed. They placed them at the strategic choke points, the Guyuk Gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK, the continental shelf off the US East Coast, the waters surrounding Japan. By the time Captain Kulikov was taking his Victor-class submarine out in 1978, he was not entering a wild ocean. He was entering a studio. The genius of SOSUS was not just the cables, it was the processing. The ocean is loud. A single hydrophone array picks up everything. Whales, drilling rigs, surface ships, rain, tectonic rumbles. The raw audio is a deafening roar. The Soviets knew about the SOFAR channel, but they believed it was useless for tracking because the signal-to-noise ratio was impossible to overcome. You can't find a whisper in a rock concert. But the Americans had a secret weapon, LOFAR, low-frequency analysis and recording. American engineers realized that the human ear is easily overwhelmed, but the eye is not. They converted the sound into visual data. Instead of listening to the audio, SOSUS operators looked at gram writers, machines that burned spectral lines onto moving paper. This was the waterfall display. Every mechanical object has a fingerprint. A Soviet submarine is a machine. It has pumps circulating coolant. It has turbines spinning generators. It has gears turning the propeller shaft. These machines vibrate, and because they are bolted to the hull vibrates. It turns the entire submarine into a massive speaker diaphragm. These vibrations create low-frequency tones, 5 Hz, 10 Hz, 50 Hz. These low frequencies are the ones that travel best in the SOFAR channel. They slice through the water for thousands of miles without losing energy. The SOSUS operators didn't listen for the ping of active sonar. They looked for the lines. They knew that the Soviet November-class submarine had a specific turbo generator that hummed at exactly 60 cycles per second. If an operator saw a 60-cycle line appear on his paper, he knew a November was out there. They knew that a damaged propeller blade created a rhythmic beat on the display. They could track individual submarines by their maintenance issues. They could tell if a sub was speeding up, slowing down, or turning. By the 1970s, the system had evolved into a global network. The data from the hydrophones traveled through the undersea cables to shore stations, NavFax, where it was processed by supercomputers and analyzed by human experts. This was the shift in perspective that the Soviets failed to grasp. The Soviets were obsessed with platforms. They built bigger missiles, faster planes, deeper diving submarines. The Americans were obsessed with information. They understood that a weapon is useless if it cannot find its target, and a target is dead if it can be seen. While the KGB was hunting for spies in Murmansk, the real spies were the hydrophones resting in the mud of the Atlantic, silently waiting. The ingenuity of the American solution was its passivity. It emitted no energy. It gave no warning. When Captain Kulikov was pinged by the destroyer in Part 1, that was the kill shot. The Americans had been tracking him for 3 days prior. They watched him leave the Barents Sea. They watched him cross the Norwegian Sea. They watched him turn south. They handed him off from one SOSUS array to the next, like air traffic controllers handing off an airliner. They only sent the destroyer when they were ready to send a message. The technological gap was staggering. The Soviets were trying to make their submarines quiet enough to evade a ship listening from 5 miles away. They didn't realize they needed to be quiet enough to evade a microphone listening from 500 miles away. But the most devastating part of this mystery is not just that the Americans could hear the Soviets. It is what they heard. Because SOSUS was so sensitive, it didn't just pick up engine noise. It picked up transients. A wrench dropped on a steel deck plate. A hatch slammed too hard. The sudden rush of high-pressure air when a torpedo tube was flooded. There are stories, whispered among old SOSUS operators, of hearing the hull pops of Soviet submarines diving too deep, of hearing the terrifying sounds of mechanical failures miles below the surface. In 1968, when the Soviet submarine K-129 sank in the Pacific, the Soviets had no idea where it was. They searched for months and found nothing. The Americans knew exactly where it was. SOSUS had recorded the sound of the implosion. They triangulated the position to within a few miles, while the Soviets wept for their lost sailors and searched the wrong patch of ocean. The CIA was already building a massive ship, the Glomar Explorer, to go out and steal the submarine from right under the Soviets' noses. That was the power of the secret. It turned the ocean into a glass tank. But the Soviets were not stupid. They knew something was wrong. And eventually, the impossible event would lead to a confrontation that would shatter their confidence forever. The mystery was about to be solved, not by Soviet genius, but by an American betrayal. The reveal was coming, and it would shake the foundations of the Cold War. The ghosts were real, and they were listening. Leningrad, the Admiralty Boardroom, 1981. The answer to the mystery that had plagued the Soviet Navy for 2 decades did not come from a breakthrough in physics. It did not come from a brilliant deduction by the KGB. It came in a plastic garbage bag, dropped in a muddy park in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and flown via diplomatic pouch to Moscow. The ghost was finally unmasked. And the face of the ghost was not a machine, it was a traitor. For years, a US Navy warrant officer named John Walker had been selling cryptographic keys to the Soviets. He was the golden source the KGB had dreamed of. But for a long time, the Soviets did not understand the true value of what they were buying. They used the keys to read diplomatic cables and fleet orders. They treated it as tactical intelligence. But in the early 80s, a team of senior Soviet naval analysts finally put the pieces together. They used Walker's keys to decrypt a backlog of historical US Navy operational summary messages, the daily reports sent from the Atlantic Fleet headquarters to the Pentagon. They sat in a secure room in Leningrad, reading the translated transcripts. And as they read, the blood drained from their faces. They were reading their own obituary. The documents were not vague, they were precise, clinical logs of Soviet submarine movements. Message dated 14th October 1979. Detected Victor II, class unit departing Murmansk. Tracking via Caesar Array B, signal strength strong. Blade rate confirms unit is K488. Message dated 16 October 1979. Unit K488 transiting Bear Island Gap, handing off to UK Array. Maintain passive monitoring. Message dated 20 October 1979. Unit K480 at station keeping in Sector 4. Acoustic signature suggests cavitation on number 3 propeller blade. The Soviet admiral reading the file dropped the page onto the mahogany table. The silence in the room was absolute. There were no satellites. There were no thermal scars. There were no radiation detectors. "They hear us," the admiral whispered. "They have always heard us." The shock was total. It was a moment of vertigo. For 20 years, the Soviet Union had believed they were playing a game of hide-and-seek in a dark forest. Now they realized the Americans had installed floodlights and removed all the trees. They looked at the maps provided in the American files. They saw the approximate locations of the SOSUS arrays. They saw the coverage zones. The Atlantic was not an open ocean, it was a kill box. Every single ballistic missile submarine, the pride of the Soviet nuclear deterrent, had been tracked from the moment it got its bottom wet. The impossible events, the destroyers waiting at the rendezvous points, the P-3 Orions dropping buoys on silent subs, suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. The Americans weren't guessing. They were watching a radar screen. Except the radar was made of sound. The psychological impact on the Soviet high command cannot be overstated. It was a humiliation. It meant that trillions of rubles spent on the naval expansion had been wasted. It meant that if World War III had broken out in 1975 or 1978, the Soviet submarine fleet would have been wiped out in the first hour. Panic set in, but it was a cold, calculated panic. "We must fix this." The order came down from the Kremlin. "We must close the gap." The investigation was over. The frantic scrambling for answers was replaced by a frantic scramble for a solution. The Soviets now knew why they were being heard. The American reports were specific. Propeller cavitation, reduction gear whine, machinery tonals. The Americans were listening to the flaws in Soviet manufacturing. The Soviet defense industry was ordered to achieve the impossible, silence the fleet. But they hit a wall. They knew the theory of how to make a quiet propeller. You needed complex, computer-controlled curves to slice the water without creating bubbles, cavitation. But the Soviet Union did not have the tools to build them. Their heavy industry was great at casting steel, but they lacked the precision electronics and multi-axis milling machines required for such delicate work. So they did what they had done with the SOSUS secret. They stole the solution. In one of the most damaging episodes of technology transfer in the Cold War, Soviet agents approached a Japanese company, Toshiba, and a Norwegian company, Kongsberg. They wanted 9-axis computer numerical control, CNC, milling machines. These were restricted technologies, banned from export to the communist bloc by international treaties. Through a complex web of shell companies and falsified end-user certificates, the deal was done. The machines were shipped to the Baltic shipyard in Leningrad. The result was the Akula-class submarine. The Akula was the response. It was the Soviet attempt to blind the SOSUS network. With the new Japanese milling machines, they carved propellers that were masterpieces of hydrodynamic engineering. They floated the machinery on active dampening rafts. They coated the hull in thick anechoic tiles. When the first Akulas slipped into the water in the mid-80s, the US Navy was shocked. The lines on the SOSUS screens, which had been bright and clear for decades, suddenly grew faint. The loud tractors were gone. The Soviets had finally built a shark. But here lies the tragedy of the Soviet system and the futility of their response. They had solved the technological problem, but they had failed the economic one. By the time the Akula entered service, it was the mid-80s. The Soviet economy was in freefall. The cost of building these titanium-hulled high-tech submarines was astronomical. They couldn't build them in mass numbers. They could only afford a handful. Meanwhile, the Americans had not stood still. While the Soviets were frantically trying to beat the passive listening of SOSUS, the US Navy was already moving to the next paradigm. They were deploying Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System, SIRTAS, ships that dragged massive listening tails behind them, mobile versions of SOSUS. They were developing active low-frequency sonar, which didn't just listen for noise, but flooded the ocean with sound to light up even the quietest submarines. The Soviets were playing catch-up in a race that the Americans were changing every 5 years. The reveal of SOSUS broke the spirit of the Soviet naval doctrine. It forced them to confront the reality that quantity did not equal quality. They had built the largest submarine fleet in history, only to find out it was the largest collection of targets in history. The final blow to their confidence came not on the battlefield, but in the data. In the late 80s, a report circulated within the US Navy, later declassified, which noted a dramatic drop in Soviet submarine patrols. It wasn't just that they were running out of money, it was that they were afraid to go out. The commanders knew the wire was there. They knew the Americans were listening. And they knew that no matter how quiet the Akula was, the ocean was still the Americans' home turf. The mystery was solved. The ghost was a cable. But knowing the truth didn't save them. It only confirmed their defeat. The North Atlantic, 1987. The Cold War did not end with a nuclear flash. It ended with a ledger. It ended when one side realized that the cost of competing was no longer measured in money, but in the disintegration of their own society. And nowhere was this calculation more brutal or more undeniable than in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Navy had achieved what they believed was a miracle. They had fielded the Akula-class submarines and the improved Victor III-class submarines. These vessels were masterpieces of theft and engineering. They were quiet. In some conditions, they were quieter than their American counterparts, the early Los Angeles-class submarines. But it did not matter. The killer statistic of the naval Cold War is not the number of missiles or the tonnage of the fleets. It is the detection probability in the open ocean. According to declassified analysis from the US Naval War College, during the peak of the SOSUS era, the probability of a Soviet submarine being detected upon entering the Atlantic was not 50%. It was not 80%. It was effectively 100%. For every Soviet submarine that crossed the GI-UK gap, there was a corresponding track file in a computer in Norfolk, Virginia. This reality forced a catastrophic strategic shift for the Soviet Union. Realizing that the Atlantic was a transparent ocean, the Soviet High Command was forced to abandon the dream of the blue water navy that Admiral Gorshkov had spent 30 years building. They could no longer threaten the American coast. They could no longer guarantee that their missile submarines would survive a transit to their launch boxes near Bermuda. So, they retreated. They adopted the Bastion strategy. Instead of roaming the world's oceans, the Soviet ballistic missile submarines were pulled back. They were ordered to stay close to home, in the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk, protected by rings of surface ships, aircraft and mines, often hiding under the polar ice cap where the background noise of grinding ice made SOSUS less effective. Think about the magnitude of that defeat. The United States Navy, with a passive system of cables and hydrophones, had effectively denied the Soviet Union access to 70% of the Earth's surface. The Soviet Navy, the second largest armada in history, was bottled up in its own backyard, afraid to venture out into the open water because they knew the big ear was waiting. The economic collapse. This technological defeat fed directly into the macro tragedy of the Soviet collapse. The story of SOSUS is the perfect microcosm of the economic war that destroyed the USSR. It is a story of asymmetric cost. The United States spent an estimated $16 billion, adjusted for inflation, on the entire SOSUS network over 40 years. It was expensive, yes, but compared to the cost of what it countered, it was a bargain. To defeat SOSUS, the Soviet Union had to redesign its entire naval architecture. They had to scrap huge portions of their fleet. They had to build expensive titanium hulls. They had to import illegal technology. they had to dedicate entire fleets of surface ships just to guard their submarines in the bastions. The Soviets were spending nearly 20% of their gross domestic product on defense, frantically trying to plug the holes in their security that American technology kept ripping open. The Americans were spending less than 6%. The SOSUS network forced the Soviets into a spending spiral they could not sustain. Every time the Americans laid a new cable, the Soviets had to spend billions to counter it. It was a war of attrition, but instead of bleeding soldiers, the Soviets were bleeding rubles, resources, and technical capacity. The imitation trap also played a fatal role, because the Soviets were always reacting, always trying to steal the milling machines or copy the designs to catch up. They never developed the indigenous innovation culture needed to leapfrog the Americans. They were running a race where the finish line kept moving, and they were wearing lead boots, the legacy of the wire. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The Cold War ended, but the cables remained. For years after the collapse, the SOSUS network kept listening, but the sounds changed. The menacing hum of the Typhoon-class submarines and the whine of the Victor-class submarines faded away, replaced by the silence of a demilitarized ocean. The legacy of SOSUS is paradoxical. It was a weapon of war that likely prevented war. Deterrence relies on certainty. If the Soviets had believed their submarines were invisible, they might have been tempted to strike, thinking they could get away with it. Or more likely, they might have panicked during a crisis, believing they had an advantage they did not actually possess. SOSUS provided the United States with information dominance. The American presidents, from Eisenhower to Reagan, knew exactly where the enemy was. They didn't have to guess. This reduced the paranoia. In Washington, when you know where the knife is, you don't lash out blindly in the dark. In the 1990s, the secrecy was finally lifted. The Project Caesar cover story was dropped. The US Navy did something extraordinary. They handed the keys to the scientists. The hydrophones that had once tracked nuclear Armageddon were now used to track whales. Marine biologists used the system to study the migration patterns of blue whales and fin whales across entire ocean basins, something that had been impossible before. They used it to listen to underwater earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The sword was not beaten into a plowshare, it was beaten into a stethoscope for the planet. Epilogue. Today, the ocean floor is more crowded than ever. Fiber optic cables carry the internet, our emails, our videos, our digital lives across the same abyssal plains where the SOSUS cables once lay in secret. But the game of ghosts has returned. A new generation of Russian submarines, the Yasen class, and Chinese submarines are entering the deep. They are quieter, deadlier, and more advanced. The US Navy is deploying new systems, unmanned underwater drones, satellite-linked sensors, and AI-driven acoustics to find them. Yet, the lesson of 1978 remains. Captain Kulikov, standing in his control room, believed in the silence of the deep. He believed that the water protected him. He was wrong. The true power of the Cold War was not the explosion. It was the knowledge. It was the ability of one side to turn the chaotic, noisy, dark ocean into a room with the lights on. The Soviet Union collapsed, not because it lacked courage, but because it was fighting blind against an enemy that could see everything. In the end, the most dangerous weapon in the American arsenal was not a missile. It was a microphone. And somewhere in the deep Atlantic, buried under decades of silt, the cables are still there. Silent witnesses to the greatest game of hide and seek ever played, waiting for the sound of the next ghost to rise from the dark.